did some journey mapping with them to better understand how remote learning has impacted the way they're completing course assignments. And then finally, like I mentioned, I will talk about that faculty focus group and how we made some changes and provided a little bit of, clear structure for conducting a focus group over Zoom. And as I go through, I'm going to talk about some of the different tools we used and the techniques. No surprise, for all of these, I'll talk about Zoom, but different like sort of parts of Zoom and the things we learned from each of these examples. All right, so for usability testing, again, I'm going to start by defining the method and when and why you would use this method for user research. So when you use usability testing is when you really want to understand how people experience a website by observing them use it. Rather than asking them, what do you think of the website? You're going to get a truer picture of how people experience a website, an app, a system by actually, observing what they're doing in it. This is really effective for interrogating any assumptions that your team might be making about how someone uses your site. So secondly, what you're doing in a usability test is asking participants to narrate their actions and impressions of the website, app, or prototype. And oftentimes you're providing them with specific tasks and watching them use the site to complete the tasks. And the reason why the tasks are really important, and you're not just like, hey, show me like the last time you went to the library website, just show me what you did, is because if you're not giving everyone sort of the same tasks, it's really hard to compare the different things people would do in the site. So you want to have some sort of consistency between one participant to the next. So that's why it's good to give everyone the same tasks, to work from a script and sort of pre-thought out tasks like that. So since the tasks are so important, one of the other things with this method is that it's really important to make your tasks as realistic as possible. So for example, for the seat booking one, you want to just say like, imagine you want to book a seat in the library. Show me what you do. Make it a little more specific. So the task we created for that one was something like, you're going to visit Cabot on Friday and then get lunch at the food trucks afterwards. Show me how you would book the seat using this site. So that way you're really getting them in the frame of mind, you're helping them get context so it doesn't feel as much of like a fake created test. It feels like this is something I could really be doing. That's what's also important about providing the context. You also want to avoid focusing on a specific feature. So give them the task and then let them do it however they're going to do it. So for instance, with some testing we've done for Hollis in the past, sometimes I'll see people take a certain path to say like make an ILL request or something like that. And you're like, oh, there's a way to do it where there's far fewer steps, but you don't want to prescribe or recommend as a moderator. You're just letting them do it how they would normally do it. And that also leads into this last bullet here, is just making sure that you remember that you're testing the interface and not the participants. So this shouldn't be about the users being able to come in with certain knowledge. This should really the focus of this is the system. Whereas some of the other methods I'm going to talk about, like user interviews and focus groups, are really more about the people. So when you're thinking about adapting these tasks in a usability test for a remote environment, the first thing is, how are you going to communicate the tasks? So there's a couple options. Depending on how you are structuring the test, you might choose to email the tasks at the beginning of the session. And then sort of as you're moderating, say, bring up the email I sent you, and I want you to work through each task one by one, especially if you have complex tasks or are working sort of with more complicated features. This can be a really good approach because you're able to write down the details. And so people can read them themselves. The second is what we did for the usability test for the seat booking, is you can just read the tasks aloud to the person. For the seat booking, it was pretty straightforward. They weren't that complex, so that's what we did. And then the other thing you can do is sort of this hybrid approach of reading them aloud and then sending the task itself, just copying and pasting it into the chat and letting the participant know that the task is available in the chat. And finally, for remote testing, which this is important for in-person testing as well, but really making sure you're breaking up complex tasks into multiple tasks or sections, especially if you're choosing just to read them. You want to make it as clear as possible to the participant when they have successfully completed the tasks. So to do that, they really just need to be able to understand what they need to do and then go. So for moderating over Zoom, so conducting a usability test over Zoom, first and foremost, this seems so obvious, but in the whatever reminder email you're sending, you want to make sure that it's clear that a user needs to join from their computer. So, especially if you're doing some kind of interview and maybe you're going to bring up a website during the interview or something, they might not realize that a usability test or this kind of interview is going to involve some kind of software, depending on how you have worded the recruitment email. So just make sure they know they need to join from their computer. And it's also like if you're going to ask them to share their screen, it's also good to like just let them know that sort of either in the email or right at the beginning of the script when you're sort of introducing the whole process. The other thing I find really important is that you're spending adequate time building a rapport at the beginning of the session. This is really important in in-person tests as well, but I feel like just like getting to know a person over Zoom, you need to spend a couple more minutes sort of, understanding how they're doing, how their week is going, just general questions. How's the pandemic impacted your academics? Have you made any changes recently? What's your study situation like? Questions that are easy for them to answer just to get comfortable talking. It will make it so much more rich when they start using the site and talking about the site if they're already just kind of warmed up. So it's really important to take that time to build adequate rapport. Definitely, I've had examples in the past where we tried to like cut out the rapport because it was like, oh, we only want to do this in like 20 minutes. And that way more people will sign up. And when you cut out the rapport, it's so hard. It's like pulling teeth to get them to start talking about the interface. So better to spend a little bit of time, at least 4 to 5 minutes up front, just getting to know the person so they feel really comfortable talking to you when you get to the point where you're asking them more specific questions. And then if you are doing, you are observing in some way, if possible, if you can ask the participant to share their own screen, they'll just be more comfortable, and there's less lag in Zoom rather than the moderator sharing a screen and then sharing control. It works pretty well, but like even if you're working on a prototype, if you can send them the link to the prototype and they can bring it up and then share their screen, I feel like it's just a little bit easier. The tech works a little bit better. Like I said, it does work okay if you sort of say like you're in VPN or you can't share the link to whatever you're testing. You can do the share screen and then give control to the participant. It's just a little bit more of a lag and it's a little bit more risky, I would say, in terms of tech and if it's going to work. So continuing on to our second slide of remote moderating tips, it's okay. I feel like it's more okay in a remote test to interrupt a participant, especially if there are technical difficulties, or especially because we're all working in home environments. If something comes up, I think, I feel like it's a little bit better understood that there is like this element of flexibility that is omnipresent right now. So like say for instance, like the audio cuts out or like you notice their video, like asking them to like, hey, can I pause you right there? And just can you shut off your video so we can hopefully get the audio quality to come back up, and asking them to repeat anything that might have been lost, to go back and show you something again. I think that is all totally fine. Just be comfortable with that and know that that's common right now. I think people have adjusted to that's the reality of working over Zoom. On your own side, definitely take the time before a test to turn off all your notifications and any like sort of, if you have Outlook notifications, Slack notifications that pop up, definitely recommend turning those off. And if you're doing a lot of testing or just are concerned about remembering to turn those off, you could even like set up a separate user account on your machine that you're just using when you're doing testing. There's also a way, I think on a Mac to do some kind of do not disturb mode. Just look into those options so that doesn't become a distraction for you during the test. I also recommend if you have an observer or two in your test to keep them muted and keep their video off. I actually, 2 weeks ago, I was a participant in a usability test for the first time in a long time. And the there was a moderator and 2 observers, and they all had their video on. And I found it incredibly distracting when the moderator would ask me questions and I would look over and there were like 2 other people. It just was like a constant reminder that like you are being watched. Where I feel like if you just see the black box in the name or just a screenshot of a person, it's not as distracting as seeing another person moving around, capturing what's going on. So I think it's a better move to keep the video off and then observers muted. Of course, at the end, maybe invite observers to ask questions, or they could put questions in the chat. But I think it's a better idea just to keep the video off for observers. And then the other thing is just have a contingency plan in the back of your mind if the tech on either end fails during the test. Just, because it's going to happen. If you're doing this regularly, it's going to happen at some point. So you could just have an email to reschedule or just a phone call follow-up. Just have it in your head like this could happen. And if it does, this is what I'll do. And rather than just like feeling like I'm losing this participant, oh no. But if their Wi-Fi cuts out, just send them an email. Hopefully they get back to you. But just have that in mind that like that could definitely happen. One story I will share, the reason for this bullet and the one about making sure people join by computer if they need to do something on their computer. I had a participant for the remote learning interviews that we did that I'll talk about in a little while. And so we had an activity where people were going to need to look at the screen. But when we did the recruitment, we just called them interviews because that's was sort of easier to understand and just sounded clearer. And we had one person and she joined from the phone. And I was like, I don't want to lose this person because it was from a school who we hadn't had a participant from. But then I realized she was on the green line while she was in this interview. So I was trying to do the interview and like adapt and not have not being able to show her what I wanted to show her. And I could just hear the sounds of the green line in the background. It was still helpful. And I was glad to have her perspective, but she wasn't able to fully participate because we hadn't made it clear that she needed to join from a computer. So we definitely made sure we did that for the rest of the participants. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more specifically about the seat booking prototype usability study that we just finished up. So you can see on the left here, this is what the actual booking interface looks like. We are using LibCal. So this is like if you went to book a carol in Cabot, this is just like the date picker and the seat picker interface. So our research questions for this were, I'm sorry, this is actually the title on this slide is wrong. It should say the usability testing, not remote teaching. So for the seat booking usability testing, can students make a reservation? Do students understand the booking policies? And do students know what to do at the time of their reservation? So we're asking them to go in, make a booking, and then review the email confirmation that was sent. So our findings, all the participants were able to make a reservation successfully. Participants mostly understood the policies. The only thing that I think could have been made clearer, and that has been made clearer since these tests, is that there weren't any group study options. So you can book a room, you just cannot co-study with another person right now. So we've made that clearer by the room picture that we have just has one seat in it rather than having a group of seats. And we have increased the visibility of the information about that this is for single student studying only at this time. Another change that people would have liked to seen, seat maps needed to be made more visible. So we increased the visibility of those links. And then a couple of things on policy that we had feedback on. Students wanted the ability to do same-day reservations, and they were looking for evening reservations as well. And students wanted the ability to have drinks and food in the library, just to be able to bring in, especially water or coffee, if that was the main thing. So this is what we learned from the usability testing. I think, like I said, this was a pretty straightforward, simple usability test. I think it translated beautifully to doing over Zoom. And we had, it was pretty easy to recruit for it as well. Speaking of recruiting, so now I'm going to talk about a couple of the tools we use for this test. So we always use MailChimp at the URC to recruit participants. All of our participant pools are managed through MailChimp. So this is the type of email that went out. And if you're looking for the actual wording, this kind of stuff, that's all available on the UX Wiki. There's examples of email recruitments. The biggest things are making it clear what you're going to do. So you can see in this one, since we have learned, we'll ask you to share your screen. And the biggest thing is sort of that sign up for a session now link. We also use Calendly. So when a participant or potential participant clicks on that sign up for a session now, they get a link to Calendly to sign up for the test. And Calendly, I believe, is freely available if you only have, a few different events, but this allows you to set different times to offer to people to sign up. You can also sync with somebody's Outlook. So that works really, really, really well too, because you automatically get an invite and it blocks on your calendar when someone goes to sign up through Calendly. So you already have it. And finally, as I mentioned, for all of these, we use Zoom. So the thing I want to mention that we learned about recording these sessions that was really important is there's a lot of different options for how you can record a Zoom meeting. Firstly, I recommend using the cloud recording option because it gives you a transcript automatically, and it's really easy to share if you're doing like collaborative note taking, which we often are with our tests. So that way, the person who did the interview is able to very easily share it with other folks who may be doing the note taking. The other options when you go into Zoom, and this is not from the Zoom client, this is actually from the Zoom web interface, you can go into the recording tab under settings and choose different options for your recording. So when we first started doing this, we were only capturing sort of the speaker view, and sometimes it's really helpful for some of the testing to be able to capture the screen share and capture the gallery view if you have multiple people. You also want to, if you're doing this, you want to save the chat messages. And you may, depending on what you're doing with the recordings, you may want to uncheck display participants' names if you wanted to share a recording but not share the name of the participant in any kind of public presentation. So I highly recommend looking at those Zoom recording options to make sure you're capturing exactly what you need to capture. All right, so that sort of is part one on usability testing. Next, I'm going to move on to journey mapping, which we did a journey mapping activity as part of the student interviews that we conducted for the Excellence in Remote Teaching and Learning in the libraries in May. So what is a journey map? Why did we use it for this particular project? So with a journey map, you are going to create a story of how someone goes through a process and how they interact with a service. And in this case, we were focusing on the library, but we didn't want to just limit it to like, tell us all the ways you interacted with the library. We were looking for like, when did the library come up in their process of completing an assignment? And how are they thinking about using the libraries? But how are they thinking also about other academic support systems, other tools, other resources? So in addition to capturing that story, which has a lot of detail, you can also capture additional information. So for us, it was thinking about the tools that they used to support the process that they were describing. And so I'll share what the journey map looked like, but we were asking them to talk through an assignment that they completed. For the particular journey map we adapted a lightweight journey mapping technique from the company MathWorks. So I had seen a presentation at UXPA Boston a couple years ago about this lightweight journey map. And I felt like I didn't want to do like a very heavily detailed journey map over Zoom. Like I just thought it would be too long, too cumbersome. So this lightweight option was a lot better and worked very well. So we wanted to do this remotely and wanted to make it as easy as possible for students to really get into specifics about how they completed their work for class, sort of before remote classes started and then during COVID-19. So we gave them specific instructions about how to do the activity, and sort of the moderator was there to walk them through the process. And so they could document the journey step by step. And the moderator was in charge of capturing the journey. The student, all they needed to do was sort of talk us through it. So it felt very much like an interview to the student, but they were actually viewing the journey map as we created it in real time in the session. So for this particular project that I'm talking about, this remote learning journeys project. So the research questions were, how are research needs impacted by remote learning? And what do students need from the libraries in order to successfully complete the assignments remotely? So at the beginning of the session, we sort of spent a lot of time building rapport, like I talked about before in the usability test. This was even more important because we were asking them to get a little bit more personal with us. We actually created 2 journey maps during the interview. The first one, we asked students to describe an assignment that they completed during fall of 2019 and sort of talk us through the steps for completing that assignment, and then also talk about the tools they used. And then they were asked to talk us through an assignment they completed during spring of 2020 and sort of, again, talk us through the journey, like what were the steps in that process? And secondly, what are the tools and services that they used? So finally, we asked them to apply an emotion to every step in the process. And we did this by just giving them little emojis, and they were able to sort of apply them. And as they said, okay, this was frustrating or this worked really well, we just dragged them in. So I'm going to show you what the completed journey maps looked like. And then afterwards, I'll also show you a template for like how we got it started. So this first journey map you're going to see, it's quite overwhelming, but just know that what the participant first saw was an empty one of these, right? So it's just a template. So you'll see 3 swim lanes that are filled out by rectangles and sort of those emojis that I mentioned. So here is the first journey map. This was for a GSAS religion PhD student. She walked us through an assignment from fall of 2019. So you can see the first lane at the top are the different activities that she did to complete the assignment. So read the book, do background research, take notes, track citations, the things you would typically expect. But, we asked them, just to provide enough detail so it was clear sort of different actions they took, but not so much that we couldn't fit it on this paper. And then the second lane here are the tools and services that went with the steps that they discussed in that first swim lane. So you can see this person used the Black Elk Speaks book at the beginning, then started doing research, used Google, Hollis, the things that were in her Carol at Widener. So really any tools and services, and a tool could be anything from, like you see here, Google or Hollis. A service was more so like meeting with your professor or having an appointment with your TF, something like that, where it was more of an interaction and engagement. And then once they had sort of mapped out the activities, the tools and services, we asked them to go back, think about each of these steps and let us know if this was like okay, or if it was like frustrating or worked really well. And then we just dragged in those emojis. So this is the one participant. This was her journey map from fall of 2019. This is the same participant and then her journey map from spring of 2020. So you can see a lot more frustration. She had to redo a lot of the work she had done. She had a research trip planned that she had to cancel. So it was just like a lot more frustrating, unsurprisingly. But what this was really helpful for was just understanding sort of one, how students talk about these things, right? What are the language they are using to describe step by step? For instance, one of the things I noticed with undergraduates is they kept saying like, "Can I still rent books from the libraries like during this time?" And just more and more people using that term rent instead of borrow, which is very interesting. And just also like new systems that they're using. So more people, especially graduate students, are buying books. So what new systems are they using? So we went back, sort of synthesized all of this, and I think we'll use it in a lot of different ways, including like, when we make updates to interfaces, making sure we're using the same terms that students are using. And then also it helps inform different services and what the libraries are promoting and how the libraries are promoting information. So this is the student whose journey maps you just saw. So she's, like I said, she was frustrated having to move online. She felt like she'd be more likely to ask for a help from a librarian while working remotely, but really felt like a graduate student should be able to do those things herself. So these are just some of the findings from her journey maps overall. So because the journey maps are so rich and have a lot of detail, we brought them, sort of synthesized them together into these student stories. this person in particular, she had a lot of the same things we were hearing from a lot of graduate students sort of encapsulated in her story, which is why we chose her as a representative of a lot of the different themes we were hearing from graduate students as they talked about the changes they had made from fall of 2019 to spring of 2020. So you can see here, like I mentioned, like buying books online because ILL wasn't available, not being able to get the books she left in her Carrel. That was another big concern from graduate students, and having that research trip canceled and having to rely on digitized resources rather than physical materials. So our overall findings from this, students are concerned about being able to get physical materials, students seeking more information on library services. We now have an email newsletter, in part because of the feedback we heard in this research, and that there was definitely a big opportunity for librarians to collaborate more with TFs for outreach and engagement. We heard from a lot of, especially undergrads, that that's where they would go to get information, to get their questions answered. So how did we do this? What were the tools we used? So to create the journey maps, we just used Google Slides. I did look into like journey mapping tools or using Miro, but I wanted there to be a super low barrier to entry. I didn't want the moderators, myself and my colleague, to feel like we had to learn this new tool and be able to do it really quickly in the moment. And I also wanted it to be something that looked familiar to the participant, since the actual process of journey mapping was probably brand new to them, but at least like looking at a Google slide probably felt very familiar. So what we did, we created this template, and I'm going to give a hat tip to Enrique Diaz, who helped me design the emojis. The ones that I originally created were like decrepit looking, and these look a lot nicer. We also piloted this process and did a pilot journey map with 2 different students. That really helped us sort of refine the size and like information we shared right off the bat. And originally we only had 3 emojis. We had like happy, meh, and mad. And we found in the pilot that people really wanted 5. People kept saying like, I was kind of between like really frustrated and like, it went okay. So that was super helpful doing the pilot to capture that and to get the instructions we were giving participants and the template right. So after this, all the data was collected, we did end up using Miro for a collaborative group analysis session. So similar to if you've done affinity diagramming in the past with Post-its or something like that, we had a group of staff members and interns actually take the participant information, jot down things they were noticing that were similar between their journey maps in Post-its, and then we group them all together to elicit those final themes and those findings that I just shared. All right, so that was journey mapping. And the last thing I'm going to talk about are focus groups. If you've heard me talk about focus groups in the past, I am resistant to doing focus groups. They are really challenging to moderate successfully. It feels like an easy thing to set up and it's not a lot of time, but I think you need to be really clear with people that everyone is on a level playing field in terms of speaking and not let any one person monopolize the conversation. So the reasons to use focus groups, just to offer facilitated group discussion on a topic. I think the reason to use focus groups in this case, it's the doing individual interviews really would have been too resource intensive. And when it's also can be better when the individuals know each other to do a focus group. Again, there are always landmines that can happen with focus groups, but just making sure that you are clear about how you intend people to participate, and you are comfortable sort of interrupting or saying like, we're gonna go to this other person. But I think prep is really important with focus groups and oftentimes overlooked. So how do you do a focus group over Zoom? So what we did for the faculty focus group that I'm going to talk about is we actually seeded the discussion via a survey. So right at the beginning, when people joined, they were asked to do a 3-question Qualtrics survey, and they were asked to put their name on it. And then we took the responses and showed them to all of the participants. And that allowed me to sort of start the discussion and say like, so-and-so, I see that you wrote that you had worked with the MAPS collection in the libraries in the past. And like, how would you like to take that online? Or so, that sort of got the ball rolling. And also sort of, we didn't do introductions because we assumed that the faculty members who were participating kind of knew each other, but that would be another way you could start a focus group, is to do introductions and have them answer a specific question related to your research goal. I think the other thing is having a variety of follow-up discussion questions that you can draw on. And for me, one other thing with all of these methods, I will say, I relied on printed scripts more often than I usually do, just because with Zoom and having, other things up on my laptop, it was just easier for me to reference a printed script. So having those follow-up questions written on a printed script, and depending on where the discussion was going, I could kind of pull from any of those on my list rather than have to generate them on the fly. And the final thing, and I think the thing that was most important and why these focus groups were successful, is to provide a concrete structure and directions on how to participate, which sounds like silly, like this is just a focus group, it's like people talking, but having this set of instructions was so helpful. So at the beginning, and I actually showed the instructions at the beginning on my screen and shared that. So participants were instructed to use the raise hand option when they were ready to speak or contribute to the discussion. And if they felt like they didn't get a chance to say what they wanted to say, or, because the person who was already talking sort of moved on to another topic and then someone else joined it, so there's those threads that can get lost in a conversation like that. I invited them to use the chat to add more, and definitely made sure that in Zoom, I had put it on to record the chat. So we had all of that information. And I also said, you need to wait to be called on. And I felt a little bit apprehensive doing that to a group of faculty members. But everyone sort of participated, followed the rules. Everyone was on the sort of a level playing field and got the opportunity to speak. So for this particular focus group that we did with faculty, the research questions are: what do faculty need from Harvard Library to ensure high quality educational experiences for students? And then what types of services should the libraries be promoting for remote classes in fall of 2020? So you saw it at the beginning. Here again is a screenshot of our the first faculty focus group. We did 3 of them. I will say this one was the largest. We did another one with 5 faculty members and then one that had 2. For the one that only had 2 faculty members, I didn't end up using the survey because in the moment it didn't seem like it would make the conversation any easier. And those 2 faculty members, I knew from when they had signed up via email, they knew each other. So they had a really great working relationship. And so I just kind of let them discuss what they wanted to talk about related to the libraries. Still had the guiding questions, but it's sort of depending on the size of the focus group, you can sort of decide how structured or unstructured you want to be. The other thing too, I think if those 2 people didn't already know each other, sort of have that relationship, I may have considered breaking those out and doing 2 interviews rather than a focus group with 2 people. So the last thing I want to add here, you may notice if you work in the libraries, Laura Wood also attended these faculty focus groups, and she actually provided an introduction to me. So she introduced me to these faculty members. And in this case, that was super helpful because she was someone they're familiar with or that they've met. And then she was able to give them context as to who I am and what I do. So also think about, is there going to be a note taker, another moderator? I will also say, not on video here, but I had help from Jess Rios and Allison Herrera, who are other UX folks in the libraries, and they were there to be note takers, but also I had them there as emergency moderators, just in case a tree fell down and took out a power line, I didn't want to lose the opportunity to talk to these faculty members. So I sort of briefed them about the script and the background and the follow-up questions and things like that. So if something were to happen to me tech-wise, life-wise during that focus group, they could have stepped in. And I really appreciated them doing that. So that was sort of my version of when I talked about in the usability test, make sure to have a backup plan. That was sort of my version for that with this particular focus group. So the findings from this focus group are, we have lots and lots of data, but just sort of 3 of the more things that have sort of already been acted on and have sort of really informed some of the things we've been doing in the libraries. So first thing was finding alternative readings that are shorter or have fewer access restrictions or available under copyright. That was a big thing folks were concerned about, not being able to access the physical materials. So how could they find alternative readings for their syllabi? Second was providing streaming media. They were looking for library hosted live streams and things like that. And then third was showing and teaching with special collections in real time over Zoom and working with archivists and library staff to do that successfully. So the tools for this one, like I mentioned we did that survey at the beginning of the sessions to seed the questions. So just a simple Qualtrics survey. And then as people joined, I dropped the link into the chat. And then once sort of everyone had joined and completed the questions, I brought up the answers just using a basic Qualtrics report and shared my screen and sort of said, like, take a minute and read through your colleagues' answers to the questions, and then use that as a jumping off point to say, like, okay, so-and-so, I see that you talked about this. Can you elaborate on that? And then had some of those follow-up questions, and that generated the discussion. Thing we learned from this about Zoom is how helpful and important the transcript is when doing any kind of user testing. So this is a faculty member talking about how he adapted his teaching. And if you see me present about this research, this is one of the clips that I've used in presentations. It was so helpful to have this searchable transcript right in Zoom because I could like get right, I was going to say zoom in, I could get right to the part of where he was talking about really easily using the search. So this was invaluable and sort of made the analysis a lot easier and just like happened a lot quicker because of this searchable transcript. All right, so that is kind of what I have to say about the focus groups. So again, just going back at what we went through, we talked about the usability testing method and the Cabot seat booking example, doing interviews and journey mapping with the remote learning interviews that we did with students, and then the focus groups that we did with faculty members. So I'm happy